Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this edition of Virtual Gigliotti, where we continue our discussion of World War II in 1944. And in this video, we're going to have a look at what's going on in the Pacific War 1944. In other words, how would the United States and the Allies begin to push back Japan and finally end the Pacific War as well. We've already talked about what's going on in Europe, and you got to keep in mind that all of these events are happening sort of simultaneously out in the Pacific. All right, so by 1944, the Japanese expansion across Asia and across the Pacific had been halted, had been stopped. We talked about the Battle of the Coral Sea, we talked about the Battle of Midway, and so now the Americans started to look at how can we push Japan back? How can we remove their ability to make war? And of course, one of the things that the Japanese relied on were the different possessions, the different colonies they had created, the different land they had taken for raw materials, for oil, rubber, you name it. And so there was a big discussion within U.S. command about how to strangle Japan from those things. In other words, if you could cut Japan off from its oil supply, from its raw material supply that it was getting out of Southeast Asia, then you might be able to limit their ability to make war. There were all sorts of ideas how to do this. For example, General MacArthur, he was the commander of the army. You'll see that those green arrows there on the map, he wanted to take a mostly land route, sort of starting here in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, back into the Philippines, and that would effectively cut Southeast Asia off from Japan. The Navy, under Chester Nimitz, the Admiral Nimitz, he was more in favor of a more direct route. He thinks that island hopping with the Marines right to Japan's doorstep would be a much easier way to go rather than slugging through the jungles and the terrain and everything else. That being said, Roosevelt and the rest of the American command told both of them, go for it. MacArthur, you cut through your land route into the Philippines, and they turned the Navy loose across the Pacific in places like the Gilberts and the Guam and other places as well. And so what you see in the Pacific War in 1944 is you see some real difficult, heavy fighting. For example, there's fighting in New Guinea towards the end of 1943 and into 1944. Right at the end of 1943, you have a battle on a little island called Tarawa. And then eventually in 1944, a horrible conflict on an island known as Saipan. Okay? Part of the reason these battles are so incredibly intense is the terrain. For example, in 1943, towards the end of 1943, when MacArthur's armies are going across New Guinea, there's jungle there. It's hot. It's foreboding. It's difficult to move things around. And so it takes him over 9 months to capture a Japanese redoubt at Rabaul, which is an incredibly long time. The other thing that causes so much trouble in the Pacific is that the Japanese soldier refuses to surrender. Even when they are beaten, they will not surrender. They will continue to fight. They get into this pattern of digging themselves into caves, tunnels, fortified positions, and refusing to leave, even if victory is impossible. They even go as far as launching what are called banzai charges, where basically the Japanese troop knows that they're beaten, refuses to be taken prisoner, and they would simply charge at American machine gun fire and the like, trying to take out as many American soldiers as they could. They would yell banzai, and they would run after right into the line of fire. So this is what they're dealing with. Anytime you come across one of these islands, every single Japanese defender is refusing to surrender for the most part, and you measure your gains in inches from one cave to the next. The Navy, the Marines, they try to do the same thing on all of these islands, especially in what are known as the Marianas, and it's the same drill. The Japanese are dug in, all these little islands like Saipan, for example, and the Americans would land on the beach, and the Japanese, unlike the Germans who were defending the beaches, the Japanese would typically let us land, and then they would use those fortifications around the island to inflict horrible casualties, slow our advance down to a grind. And you'll see these little islands, for example, in the Marianas, an island like Saipan, It takes over a month to capture thousands and thousands of men because you're literally going through each fortification, going through each cave. The Japanese troops not surrendering, one by one, having to deal with that. Also, then by the middle of 1944, you start to see that the U.S. is getting closer and closer to Japan and to the Philippines. The Japanese try to stop us by sending their carrier fleet to the Marianas around Saipan. The Marianas are this string of islands out in the middle of the Pacific. Guam, for example, one of the U.S. territories, would be a good example of Marianas Island. Well, the Japanese fleet arrives. There's another huge naval battle that takes place. It is known as the Battle of Philippine Sea. All right, this whole area in here is known as the Philippine Sea. It's part of the Pacific Ocean, and you're fighting on all of those Mariana Islands, such as Guam and Saipan and some of the others. So this battle takes place. Again, aircraft carriers play a huge role in fighting the Battle of the Philippine Sea. You also have American submarines involved. We talked about the German U-boats. America had a lot of submarines out in the Pacific that were able to inflict a lot of damage on the Japanese Navy. In fact, by the end of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese Navy really had to kind of withdraw and so forth. The Americans are able to take a couple of key islands. Guam, for example, is still a U.S. territory today. It's a pretty interesting place. Looks just like any other place in the United States. Street signs, you name it. Do a Google search if you don't believe me. And then the other island they grab, probably never heard of before, is called Tinian. And Tinian is a really, really important island to grab because if you have a B-29, which we'll talk about in the next video, well, probably next week, if you have a B-29, you can take off from Tinian and actually fly all the way to Japan and drop bombs on them. In fact, Tinian is the island where the Enola Gay left from to launch the first nuclear attack on Hiroshima. All right, so those little things in 1944 make a big difference, and you can see it's more or less the same story on all of these little islands. I mean, it's just the Japanese refusing to surrender and so forth. MacArthur eventually gets to the Philippines at the end of 1944, the autumn of 1944. Many in the American military were kind of skeptical. Why even bother trying to retake the Philippines? Let's just get to Japan. But for MacArthur, it was personal. He had promised them that he would return. And in some ways, his men paid the price for that because the fighting was incredibly challenging. The Philippines are a big string of islands, and the first one that takes place is on the island of Leyte in Leyte Gulf. The Americans sort of took the Japanese by surprise. MacArthur and his men land. MacArthur was a showman. He brought his own press corps with him to pick these famous pictures, of him getting out of the landing craft, and he tells the people of the Philippines, "I have returned," and all those things are nice and wonderful. However, the Japanese, again, are determined to hold on to the Philippines, just like all these other little islands, and so the fighting that takes place there is fierce. The Japanese counterattack, and that at first is somewhat successful. Americans are attempting more and more amphibious landings, all the islands across the Philippines, and it's not until the end of April of 1945 that the Japanese are kicked out of the capital of the Philippines, which is called Manila. So this goes on for a very long time. Along the way, too, the Japanese, we talked about the banzai charges, they also begin what are called kamikaze attacks. You might remember that from your U.S. class. Well, the Japanese realize that their situation is fading. They're running out of ships, and aircraft carriers have been damaged, and their navy's not as good as it was at the start of the war after all this fighting. So they start to use kamikaze attacks in airplanes. In other words, the pilots would agree to become kamikazes. They felt they were doing it for their emperor, for their country, and they would take off in their airplane. They would find an American ship, and they would crash their airplane into the ship, causing horrific damage to the ship and, of course, the men on board. And kamikaze attacks become a big threat to the American fleet. The Americans spend all sorts of times and energy trying to defend themselves in sort of a layered anti-aircraft approach because of these kamikaze attacks that would take place in 1944 and into 1945. So as we end 1944 in the Pacific, U.S. is grinding across the Pacific, taking all of these islands, wearing the Japanese Navy down to the point where they're going to be pretty ineffective, to the point where they have to use kamikaze attacks. But the war is far from over as we enter 1945. So hopefully that helps you out, and we'll see you again next time on Virtual